Hi everyone, my name is Andrea Joss and I am going to be your professor for the next 5 classes in 4020. I am going to be teaching you the protein and amino acid section of this course, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. So just a little bit about the next 5 classes that you have with me, just to set the stage here before we get going. As I mentioned, I'm teaching the whole protein section of KIN 4020, and all of my slides that I'm going to be using for these 5 lectures are on eClass. So I have posted them on eClass. If you go on there, you should be able to see it. It's under that first topic heading. All of my protein lectures are there. Please take a look at those as I am going through the information, because that is essentially your lecture slides for the protein section. I realize that Dr. Sidia has a book and lecture slides on protein as well, but those are not going to be the ones that you should be using. You should be using the ones that I post, okay? So just to reiterate again, you will be tested on information contained within my slides and my lecture recordings, not the ones that Dr. Sidia has provided for you. So that's kind of listed over here. His notes are great, but for the purposes of the protein section that I'm teaching you in this class, I consider his notes to be supplementary. So some of the material within his notes I do cover in this class, so you will see some overlap, but some of it I don't, okay? And so the material that is not covered in Dr. Sidia's notes will not be testable material. Again, the material that I present in these classes on my lecture slides are the testable material. Okay, so I've written this here. My lecture notes and my recordings are what's testable. If you have any questions about anything as we're going through, because obviously these lectures are pre-recorded, please feel free to email me at ajos@yorku.ca if you do have any questions. So yeah, those are the lecture guidelines that I have for this class. A little bit about me. So again, as I said, there's me right there. My name is Andrea Joss, and I am a nutritionist and applied exercise physiologist. So human nutrition is actually my main research area. It's the area that I've been trained in. I actually started at York as an assistant professor in 2019. So I taught in 4020 last year as well, and obviously I'm teaching it again this year. But prior to coming to York, I was at Brock for 4 years before that in their kinesiology program, and I created and taught their Intro to Nutrition class as well. So I've been teaching nutrition for a very long time. I also taught it at McMaster as a graduate student, so I did my PhD at Mac, and I taught their nutrition classes as well with my advisor at the time. Speaking of the fact that I do have a degree in nutrition, I did my master's at the University of Toronto in nutritional sciences, where my main research focus was looking at whole foods for disease risk reduction and health promotion, essentially. So we looked at nuts, we looked at dairy products, we looked at whole grain foods and things like that to reduce disease. And with respect to my PhD, as I mentioned, I did my PhD at McMaster, and my main area of focus was actually protein research, which is why this is so fitting for me to present the protein section of this course. So my PhD work was in protein, weight loss, lifestyle modification, and I really assessed various high-quality protein foods and how they affect body composition and bone health, and weight loss as well. And actually, body recomposition, so that's the change of, or the redistribution, if you will, of fat and lean mass within the body, which favors an increase in lean mass and a reduction in fat mass. And so that was essentially my area of research. I also want to mention that I am a mom of 2 little girls, and life is a bit hectic and crazy right now with them being at home doing homeschooling. because obviously with the pandemic. So I just want to say that we're all doing our best, trying our hardest to hold it together, to keep things going forward, and I will do that as well for you as your professor in this class. So again, please feel free to email me if you have any questions about what I'm talking about, and with that, I will get started with the information. Okay, so this is the first class in the series of 5. So when we start talking about protein, I think it's really important for us to really get some context here. So what are these sources of dietary protein that Canadians are eating the most? And this is a really interesting infographic over here, which kind of details that. So these data are coming from a 2015 survey, which I'll explain in one of the following slides, regarding what Canadians are actually eating with respect to protein. So this is the percent of Canadians who eat these sources of protein on any given day. So almost every Canadian, according to this nutrition survey, consumes some dairy product in the day. Now, the caveat here, of course, is how much dairy product. I mean, it could be milk and coffee and things like that. So we don't actually know from this infographic how much of each protein source they're consuming. But regardless, it does show that about 93% or 94% of Canadians are consuming some form of dairy. 63% consume some meat, 56% some eggs, 43% chicken, and then, as we get into the plant proteins, well, 17% fish, but then as we get into some of these plant protein sources, the numbers are dropping down a fair bit. Also, what I find is interesting is the proportion of individuals in Canada who are lacto-ovo vegetarians and or vegans. So you can see that from looking at this figure down here. Let's take a look here. 1.6% of Canadians exclude fish, shellfish, meat, and poultry from their diet. So it's essentially a vegetarian diet. And even less than that are those that exclude animal products altogether. So for the most part, Canadians are eating a fair amount of animal products as their protein sources. Now these are surveys that I was talking about. So let me just move my head over here. Okay. So the way in which the Canadian government figures out what Canadians are eating, and the way in which researchers can assess in most epidemiological studies the relationship between nutrition and health is by looking at these health surveys. So in Canada, we have the main one called the Canadian Community Health Survey, and there were 2 cycles of it, one in 2004 and one in 2015. And as part of these particular cycles, or these surveys rather, in each individual cycle, they did a 24-hour recall. So somebody called up these families on the phone and spoke to the person in the house and said, what did you eat in the past 24 hours? And so there's a series of standardized questions that the interviewer asks the person to help them recall what they were eating the previous day, and they jot everything down, and that's essentially how we in Canada figure out what Canadians are eating. So right off the bat, you're probably saying to yourself, okay, this is, how can we figure that out from just one day of food? Not everyone's single day of food reflects how they always eat, blah, 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 all of that type of stuff. And you're absolutely right. It's not perfect by any means. Our way of assessing nutrient and dietary intake is not great, but it's still a really good way of, on a population scale, looking at what we're eating. And if we look at these particular cycles, so CCHS 2004 had almost 35,000 individuals that they initially contacted and ended up with around 33. For the 2015 cycle, it was a little bit less, still ended with around 19,000. These are really large groups. Now, Canada population is much larger, but nonetheless, we have some pretty good responding rates with respect to these surveys. And here's some more demographics over here. It's interesting to take a look at these demographics from 2004 to 2015. So obviously the mean age of individuals has increased a little bit. The ethnicity as percent white went down in the 2015 cycle, so maybe it's a little more ethnically diverse, let's say, in the 2015 cycle. Other such things. Interestingly, body mass index has gone up in the 2015 cycle compared to the 2004 cycle. And this is to be expected given the other trends that have been measured within the Canadian population with respect to obesity. Smoking status has gone down from 23.7 to 17.6, which is a good thing. And interestingly, supplement use in the past 30 days, percent yes, has actually gone up. So more Canadians are using supplements, and this can include multivitamins as well. Anyway, these are just some demographic information that I find interesting from the CCHS. So what did they find in the CCHS? These are just two particular figures that I have here that in relation to protein intakes. So if we look at this one on the left over here, we can ask the question, are Canadians eating enough protein? So not necessarily what types of protein they're eating, but are they eating enough? And I will get into the actual nutrient recommendations in a little bit, but essentially the answer is yes. According to our current nutrient recommendations, in which I've put a red box over here in this figure, we as Canadians and Americans too, because we share the same recommendations, we are supposed to consume protein as a percentage of our total energy from 10 to 35%. So I've put this box around 10 to 35, and we can see that at all the different age groups, we are above the 10%, actually closer to around 15 to 20%, so somewhere in between there. So according to the guidelines, Canadians are consuming enough protein. They're on the lower end of the guidelines, but they are consuming enough, okay? And this guideline is called the AMDR, or the Acceptable Macronutrient Distribution Range, which I'll speak about in a moment. Another interesting figure is this one over here, and this is a comparison between CCHS 2004 and 2015. So 2015 is in the dark blue and 2004 is in the light blue. And this is actually looking at carbohydrates, fats, and proteins in the younger age group versus the older age group. And what we see here is that from 2015 to 2004, we saw a reduction in carbohydrate intake, an increase in protein and fat intake. So we have this little increase in fat and this little increase in protein. So on the figure, it may not look like so much, but it actually is quite a huge difference on a population level. So overall, we're seeing that Canadians are eating less carbohydrates and more fat and more protein. And I think this goes with the current trends as well of, the popular diets, the low carbohydrate diets, the high protein diets, things of that nature. So it kind of follows the trends in nutrition at the time. So this is our Canada's Food Guide. This is our most current one right now, as you can see here. And this is our older one. And you may have been more familiar with the older one. The new one just came out about, 2 years ago now, actually, early 2019. So you may have seen this one a fair bit more. Anyway, I want to focus on the protein foods because that's what we're talking about here. So in the old food guide, you'll notice that mostly we get our protein from the milk and alternatives group over here in blue and the meat and alternatives group over here. And there's a whole bunch of pictures of the types of foods that are protein related or that provide us with a fair amount of protein, broken down into serving sizes. And it tells us how many servings we're supposed to have based on our age and our sex. Well, the new food guide, as you can see here, doesn't really do any of that. So we don't have these same colorful food groups anymore. We have 3 food groupings instead, as you can see. And here's our protein group. So it's a mixture of all different types of meat and dairy, plant-based type proteins. But the general guideline is that protein foods, whenever you have a plate, protein foods should make up about 1/3 of your plate. So there's huge differences between the old food guide and the new food guide. Diving a little bit more into our current food guide, just to shed some light on the policy in Canada regarding food. So this is again the new 2019 Canada's Food Guide. There's 3 different food groupings. We have fruits and vegetables, protein, and grains. and protein, as I said, is 1/4 of the plate. So these represent our FBDGs, or our food-based dietary guidelines. The new food guide is flexible, it's more simple, it provides more general dietary advice, so it's not prescriptive like the other one was. One of the main features of this food guide talks about choosing plant-based foods more often, and a lot of the plant-based protein sources are actually listed here. So beans and legumes and nuts and soy and those types of things, like tofu over here, you can see that on here. Interestingly, milk and cheese were a big part of the old food guide. It's almost, you could say, dairy products. Well, not almost. Dairy products did actually have their own food group in the old guide, but interestingly, they are not depicted at all on this food guide snapshot. So milk is missing and cheese is missing, but various other protein sources are here. Okay. Again, the food guide is not prescriptive anymore. And here's the US MyPlate, the current US MyPlate, and you can see it's quite similar to Canada's new food guide. So, you know, the dietary pattern, the emphasis on dietary patterns is greater than the prescriptive nature of here, have this one food, have this other food. And that's the case for the proteins in the US MyPlate as well. With respect to our nutrient-based dietary guidelines, we also have these. So these are those guidelines that say consume X amount of milligrams of calcium per day, or 0.8 grams per kilo of protein per day. That's the RDA for protein. So you may have heard some of these terms being thrown around a little bit. I'll try and keep the discussion to protein specifically. There are 2 nutrient-based dietary guidelines, and overall these are called the dietary reference intakes, and they're the same for the USA and for Canada. We have acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, which I've already alluded to a little bit. These are the AMDRs, okay? And they represent 10 to 35% of our daily calories from protein. And if you go to the previous couple slides, you'll see that red box that I drew around in that figure, and that was showing the 10 to 35 range, and showing that Canadians are consuming around 15 to 20% of their daily energy as protein, so they are within the range, the acceptable range. The RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilo per day for adults, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. This figure down on the left here, it's just showing that within the AMDR range, so 10 to 35, the guidelines stipulate that you can consume a fair amount of protein and still be within the guidelines. So you can have higher carbohydrate diets with only 10% protein. You can have higher fat diets with still around, 10 to 15% protein. And then you can have high protein diets, which are up to 25, 30% protein, and that's still within the AMDR. So there's a lot of wiggle room in there, okay? Now with respect to the RDA is actually an amount of protein. Well, I'll talk about it in relation to protein, but this is the amount of protein that is set to meet the recommendations for almost 98% of the population. And the RDA is derived from this EAR, which is our estimated average requirement, okay? And the EAR is derived from research studies, several research studies over the years that have estimated the average requirement of a particular nutrient in the population. And so this EAR reflects what 50% of the population requires. But that's not good enough. You have to actually, in a recommendation, you have to recommend the amount that is acceptable to consume for a nutrient that meets the needs of most of the population. And so that's why you end up recommending an RDA. RDA is mathematically derived, and it's actually 2 standard deviations away from what the estimated average requirement is of the nutrient, okay? So the RDA is mathematically derived, and because of that, we can say if we set our recommendations at the level of the RDA, then this encompasses nearly 98% of the population. So from our nutrient-based dietary guideline perspective, all of those guidelines reflect RDAs or AIs, which I'm not going to get into AIs because we're not talking about other nutrients. We're just talking about protein in this case, but Dr. Cedia may talk about RDAs and AIs when he gets into discussions about micronutrients in the class, okay? Anyway, here is the RDA for males and females of varying ages over here. So you can see that anyone above 18 years of age has an RDA of 0.8 grams per kilo per day. And this is contentious. It's been debated in the protein nutrition world because people do believe that once you reach older adulthood, you do require more protein. And there's several studies showing that that's the case. So, you know, it's possible that in the near future we may see the RDA being revised, particularly for older adults, okay? You can see here it is higher in growing youth because this does need to account for the growing body, the growth spurts and puberty and things like that. But then once we reach 18 years of age, it drops back down slightly to 0.8. So how do we use these RDAs? And again, these are relative numbers. Okay, we have a 60 kilogram female that's 25 years of age. So we take their weight, 60 kilos, and we multiply it by the RDA that corresponds to their age. So she's 25, so she would be 0.8. And we come up with a gram amount, okay? So by doing this calculation, the amount of protein based on the RDA that this individual should consume is around 48 grams per day of protein, okay? And you know, you can look at various charts, which I'll show you in the next slide or so, about how much protein is in various foods, and then you figure out in your day if you're consuming the adequate amount of protein according to the RDA. I just put this in here. I did a quick calculation. I calculated what the AMDR would be for this particular individual, assuming she consumes a 2,000 calorie diet. And if you do the calculation based on the fact that protein is 4 calories per gram, then you end up with AMDR, or a macronutrient distribution range, again corresponding to the 10 to 35% range of 50 grams to 175 grams per day. So this is a huge range that we're talking about over here. And so I just want to make the point here that the RDA of, you know, when we calculate it, 48 grams per kilo, usually corresponds to the lower end of the AMDR. Okay? Now, if we take the upper end of the AMDR, the 175 grams, and figure out what the relative amount of protein per kilo would be for this particular person, this is how we do this calculation. So we take 175 grams of protein, divided by 60 kilos, and we end up with 2.9 grams per kilo per day. 2.9 is much higher than 0.8, okay? But this is the upper end of the AMDR. So I just want to make this point again. The RDA in particular is the minimum daily average intake to meet the needs of 98% of healthy people. And this is to prevent disease. It's not the amount needed to achieve optimal health. The AMDR is very wide, and so you can consume a lot more protein than what the RDA is set at. But if you consume at least the RDA, then according to population statistics and research for protein, you should be consuming the minimum daily average needed to meet the needs of most healthy people. So that's this relationship between RDA and AMDR. Determining protein needs. So let's go through this. So let's determine your body weight in kilos. So we're kind of going to do some additional calculations based on the previous slide. So for you, let's determine your particular protein needs. So figure out your own weight in kilos, and here's the way to convert pounds to kilos over here. So how do we determine the grams of protein required per day for you? Okay, so I want you to multiply your weight in kilograms by the specific RDA recommended for your age group. Now, I'm just assuming that everyone in the class is over 18. So we would be using the 0.8 grams per kilo per day. So here's an example. If you're a 23-year-old male who weighs 90 kilos, you do require 0.8 grams per kilo per day. And if you do the calculation over here, 0.8 times 90, you end up with 72 grams of protein per day. So I want you to take a second here and try and figure that out for yourself. So figure out how much protein you require. And do that calculation. You can pause the video if you'd like and do that. And then you can put us back on again. All right, so moving on then to the next slide. This is where you can figure out how to plan your day. So I'm going to use the example that I had already created from the previous slide. So 72 grams per day of protein. And if you just take a look at this particular table over here, these are rough estimates of particular protein food sources, the serving sizes of the food, and the average grams per serving size that's listed here. So in order for this 90-kilo male, this young man, to eat 72 grams per day of protein, I've kind of broken it down here. So maybe for breakfast, he'd have 2 eggs, which is 12 grams of protein. As a snack, he'd have 1 6-ounce Greek yogurt, which is 16 grams of protein. And maybe for dinner, he'd have a 6-ounce cooked steak, which provides 48 grams of protein. Now, he's probably not having 6 ounces of steak. He's probably having even more than that. So you can see how the amount of protein that one eats can really increase dramatically based on the source of protein that you choose. You can see there's quite a large difference between the amount of protein that's in animal products compared to vegetables or plant products. So if we take a look at this, half a cup of vegetables cooked has about 2 grams of protein. This is half a cup, but that's quite a fair bit. You know, if you have a full cup of vegetables, maybe on the side of your plate, that's only 4 grams of protein. If you have 3 ounces of steak, fish, poultry, that corresponds to 24 grams of protein. So that's a lot more. So you can see how you can plan the amount of protein that you're eating in a day based on your requirements. And of course, if you're doing exercise or you're active or there's other such considerations, you're pregnant, things like that, you know, that would increase your protein requirements. So I have an exercise for us to do here. This is a nutrition literacy lesson, okay? And I want to say before I start this discussion that I have absolutely no issues whatsoever with plant-based diets or with, you know, consuming protein-rich plant-based diets and getting, you know, most of our protein from plants. Now, it does require more planning if you are vegan or vegetarian to achieve the amount and quality of protein that your body requires, but it's absolutely doable. So I just want to put that out there before I even go down this road, okay? But I thought that I would bring this picture to your attention because just first off, there's a lot of things wrong with it. But this type of stuff is floating around in the Twitter sphere and in like all around the internet, okay? And so we need to put our thinking caps on and we need to understand nutrition literacy in order for us to really see what this is. And so what I mean by nutrition literacy is that you look at something and based on your education, based on the fact that you've taken 40/20 and you've taken other such classes potentially where you've discussed nutrition or, you know, other such construct, you're able to take a look at something like this and think, oh, there's something a little off about this. I really need to, you know, be careful when I promote something that I'm not totally sure about, okay? So you'll see what I mean in a moment. So here we go. Do you really need meat to get protein? So the answer is no, right off the bat. I just told you that and I showed you that on the previous slide, okay? But then this particular figure goes on to show a pretty piece of beef and a pretty piece of broccoli. Beef, 6.4 grams of protein per 100 calories, and broccoli, 11.1 grams of protein per 100 calories. So wait a second. This figure is showing me that broccoli per 100 calories contains a lot more protein than beef. And then it's saying plants have all the protein you need with none of the violence. So first of all, there's a bias there that we need to just be aware of with respect to protein and animal welfare and things like that. People can have their opinions, absolutely, but if this is about nutrition, we have to think of the facts here. And looking at this per 100 calories, I don't even know if that's necessarily appropriate, because 100 calories of beef is way less than 100 calories of broccoli, okay? So let's break this down a little bit. And this was done by a dietitian, you can see over here, and the data that she used to break this down and figure out the fallacies in this particular picture were from the USDA, so the US Dietary Analysis database, okay? So let's take a look here. So 100 calories of beef, as I said, is a very small amount. This represents 2 ounces of beef versus 100 calories of broccoli, which is about 2 cups of broccoli, okay? And these numbers in and of themselves are actually wrong. If you look at the USDA database, which is a database of, you know, hundreds of thousands of different foods and their nutrients in them, then you'll see that these are actually wrong. So actually 13 grams of protein per 100 calories of beef, not 6.4, and 7 grams of protein per 100 calories of broccoli, not 11.1. So in actual fact, the numbers are higher for beef per 100 calories than for broccoli. But I think the biggest issue here is the comparison between the calories, because really they should be comparing 2 different foods by their weight or their gram amount in order to assess the comparable levels of protein. So this is another issue with this particular figure here. So beef actually has 21 grams of protein per 100 grams, and broccoli has 3 grams of protein per 100 grams. And so we can see similar figures in the previous slide or the table that I showed you as well. So I think that it's important for us to just take a step back and understand that, you know, not everything that we read with respect to nutrition is right and is true, and we need to be able to use the knowledge that we've learned in this class and others to make educated decisions about things that we see online. Okay, so this is just an example of perhaps individuals who have a bias and an agenda putting something out there that is false in order to, you know, make people think a certain way. All right, and nutrition is fraught with this. There's so many misconceptions out there with respect to nutrition. Anyway, I just wanted to bring this up as a little bit of food for thought for you. And here actually is a link to the Canadian nutrient file, the CNF. And I actually use this file a lot in my research because I do nutrition research, as I said. But like the USDA database, this is the Canadian database here, and it has thousands of different foods. And if you go to this website, you can type in any food you want and it'll pop up the nutritional information. So I encourage you to take a look at that. A little bit more food for thought here. Since we're talking about plant-based diets and plant-based meat analogs and things like that, or I'll bring up this discussion. I thought that I would put this out there, and you've probably heard this, the Beyond Meat burger craze, or the plant-based patties that are at Tim Hortons, or the plant-based burgers and things like that. You know, it's a bit of a craze right now in that people are looking for plant-based alternatives to meat. Meat has kind of gotten a bit of a bad rap lately because of its, you know, maybe higher saturated fat content and things like that, so some more adverse nutrients. However, we have to really take a step back and think about what we're talking about with respect to these comparing meat to these plant-based analogs. So while it's true that the food guide is calling for more plant-based alternatives and consuming more plant-based meals, I pose this question to you: is this what Canada's food guide meant by plant-based? And I say this because all of these burgers listed here, the burgers, the hot dogs, the sausage patties, you know, the burgers with the fake bacon and the fried onion rings and oozing with mayonnaise. These are all unhealthy ways, quote, of consuming plant-based foods. And all of these burgers and patties are highly processed. So I don't think that this is necessarily what Canada's Food Guide meant by being plant-based. So it's just something more to think about. So let's take a closer look at this Beyond Meat burger. I have to say it's delicious. I've had it several times. But I think, you know, if I were to choose personally like if I had the choice between having a Beyond Meat burger versus a beef burger, probably 8 times out of 10 I would choose a beef burger than the Beyond Meat burger. I love plant-based protein sources like beans and lentils and legumes and tofu and things. But when they're processed in this way, I try to avoid them as much as I can. So the Beyond Meat burger, it's made from yellow pea protein isolates, and this burger contains about 20 ingredients, whereas a pure beef burger has 1, maybe 2 ingredients in it. Okay, it's a highly processed food. It's an ultra processed food, and processed foods have been associated with consuming more energy and gaining weight. They've also been associated with hypertension because of the sodium in them. They've been associated with cardiovascular disease and other such things, okay? A National Post article says vegan Beyond Meat burgers are just ultra processed patties that can be bad for our health. And this registered dietitian who I follow, I follow her on Instagram and on Twitter. She's quite opinionated, but knows her stuff really well. She says just because a product is plant-based, it doesn't mean it's automatically healthy, okay? And this is kind of what I was getting at in the previous slide, right? Plant-based, the Beyond burger is not necessarily what Canada's Food Guide had in mind with respect to plant-based. French fries, she says, are also plant-based, but they are also a food to potentially eat sparingly. Now, don't get me wrong. I think, you know, eating unhealthier things potentially in moderation is an important part of life and our culture and enjoyment and all of the above. So I'm certainly not one to cut specific things out of my diet. But being aware of what we're putting in our mouths is also an important tool. So just to put this out there regarding the Beyond Meat burger. This comparison was from a paper, and I have the citation down over here. They compared ground beef to soy-based alternatives to a pea-based alternative. And the pea-based protein patty is this Beyond Meat burger. The soy-based alternative is your usual soy patty, which used to be, the main type of plant-based alternative burger before these other Beyond burgers came around. Anyway, if you look at the nutrition facts here, the serving sizes are all the same, so 113 grams. The calories are relatively the same. Actually, the ground beef burger has less calories than the other two, okay? And if you look even closer, let's take a look here. So we see the total fat is quite similar. Actually, the pea-based is higher at 18 grams. Saturated fat is again similar. So 5 grams for ground beef, 8 grams, does that say? Excuse me. 8 grams for soy and 5 grams for pea. Cholesterol is about 80, does that say 80 or 60? 60 grams for the ground beef, and of course there's 0 cholesterol in the soy-based or the pea-based because they're not made from animal products, and cholesterol is only found in animal products. It has 0 carbohydrates and sodium. So this is a big one that I wanted to point out. So in the ground beef burger, there's 70 milligrams of sodium in a whole beef patty. In both of these soy and pea-based alternatives, the sodium is much, much higher. So 370 and 350 grams, milligrams of sodium in those particular burgers. And again, this plays on the factor. This is because they're highly processed. And so that's why the sodium content is higher. With respect to the nutrients down here, we can see all the nutrients in beef, some similar ones in soy, and there's less particular nutrients that on this nutrient facts panel were actually reported for the pea-based alternative. So I'm not saying that this doesn't contain nutrients. They may have chosen not to report them on the nutrient facts panel. But regardless, you can see here some of the main ones in beef compared to pea-based alternatives. So I think it's important for us when we're talking about protein to think about the source of protein, think about the amount that we need to eat in a day, and think about these alternative sources that we can be adding to our diets. Plant-based sources of protein are important for us to consume because they do contain a lot of other vitamins and minerals and antioxidants and fiber and other such things that animal-based foods, protein sources do not necessarily have. But I hope that so far I've kind of opened your eyes a little bit to this idea. If you weren't aware already of the ugly side, if you will, of some of the plant-based foods and the plant-based protein sources in particular, these highly processed plant-based foods. So with that, I'm finishing the class for today right on time, and I'm going to start the next class with actually getting into what is protein. But I thought I'd take the first class and kind of set the stage a little bit for you as we continue on. Okay, have a great day. We'll talk to you later.